Hey there and welcome. If you're someone who likes to unwind by diving into the weird, gritty details of history, especially the kind they don't usually teach in school, you're in the right place. Before we get rolling, I'd love it if you'd drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing seeing just how far this little community of history lovers stretches across the world. And hey, if you find this kind of content relaxing, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future deep dives into the strange corners of the past. Now, close your eyes for a second. Okay, maybe don't if you're driving or doing dishes, but imagine this: a rough wooden table, scratched and stained from years of use. On it sits a bowl of thin grayish porridge, a slice of rock-hard bread, so dense it could double as a building material, and maybe if you're lucky, a few pieces of overcooked meat that are more bone than protein. That right there was a good meal for most people in medieval Europe. When we think about food in the Middle Ages, there's this tendency to picture long banquet tables, roasted pigs with apples in their mouths, overflowing goblets of wine, and people cheering huzzah at every course. And yes, that was a thing for the elite. For everyone else, food was a daily battle. It wasn't about taste or presentation. It was about survival. So what made food in the Middle Ages so rough for the average person? Let's dig into it. First off, let's talk about flavor, or more accurately, the lack of it. If you walked into a medieval peasant's home, you wouldn't catch a whiff of cinnamon or nutmeg wafting from the kitchen. Spices like those were imported from faraway places like India or the Middle East, and they were insanely expensive. How expensive? Try this: in the 11th century, a single pound of nutmeg could cost as much as 7 fattened oxen. 7. That's your entire farm walking away for one spice jar. These kinds of spices were strictly for the rich, the clergy or powerful merchants who could afford such indulgences. For the rest of the population, flavor came in the form of garlic mustard seeds or maybe some vinegar. That was about as exciting as it got. Forget curry, forget stew packed with herbs. Just imagine everything you eat tastes vaguely like boiled socks. Now, let's move on to produce. Fresh fruits and vegetables. Forget about it. There was no refrigeration, no mass farming, no international shipping. That meant produce was strictly seasonal. You might get onions, leeks, and cabbage if you were lucky enough to have a garden. But even then, these hardy vegetables weren't exactly giving you bursts of flavor or nutrients. Most of the time, people relied on grains. Bread porridge and more bread usually made from barley or rye. Wheat was more refined, and that meant more expensive. Guess who got to eat the good wheat? Yup, not the peasants. The result: a diet loaded with carbs, but short on pretty much everything else. Vitamins, protein, healthy fats. Those were rare, which led to some serious health issues. Malnutrition was rampant. People were shorter, physically weaker, and more prone to disease. You think picky eaters are a modern problem? Back then, even if you hated porridge, you were still eating it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because that's all there was. Now, let's talk meat. It's easy to assume everyone in the Middle Ages ate roast chicken or ribs fresh off the spit, but meat was a luxury item. Most families raised animals not for eating, but for their secondary uses. A cow meant milk, chickens meant eggs, pigs. They were the exception because they were cheap to keep, but even then, slaughtering one meant giving up a future source of food. So meat was reserved for special days, weddings, religious feasts, or if the animal got sick or old. And when meat was available, they didn't waste a single scrap. This was true nose to tail eating. That meant organs, heads, feet, whatever you could chew, you ate. You might trap a rabbit or a pigeon if you were lucky. But be careful, if you were caught hunting on noble land, it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. You could lose a hand, or worse. Poaching was considered theft from the king himself. Now, for folks who lived near rivers or the coast, fish was a bit more accessible. But guess what? That fish wasn't fresh most of the time. It was dried, salted, or smoked, sometimes to the point of being more salt than fish. This stuff was packed into barrels heavily salted and stored for months. Picture trying to chew your way through a piece of overcooked rubber dipped in ocean water, and you've got the idea. Preservation was a big deal, and it was pretty much the only way to avoid total starvation in winter. Without refrigeration, peasants relied on pickling, fermenting, salting, and drying. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Apples were dried into tough little rings. Cucumbers and onions went into vinegar jars. It was survival food, not cuisine. Even bread and ale, two of the most important parts of the medieval diet, weren't always safe. Some bakers stretched their dough with chalk sawdust or acorns to make ends meet. You might break a tooth on your daily loaf, or get no real nutrition out of it at all. And ale, which was safer than water, thanks to the fermentation process, was often watered down to squeeze more money out of each batch. There were even laws in place, like the assize of bread and ale in 13th century England, to try and prevent this kind of fraud. But guess what? Enforcement was spotty at best. And speaking of water, it was basically poison. With human and animal waste everywhere, drinking from a local stream was like playing Russian roulette with your health. That's why weak ale was the drink of choice even for kids. It had just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, but not enough to get you drunk unless you drank a lot, which some people definitely did. All of this brings us to one of the most stomach-turning facts about medieval eating hygiene, or rather the complete lack of it. There were no germ theories, no food safety standards, no real understanding of bacteria. People kept their livestock inside to stay warm, which meant your dinner was often prepared within arm's reach of a pig, rooting through its own waste. Food was stored in smoky corners or dirt floors, and contamination was practically guaranteed. So if you're ever feeling down about your leftovers or wishing your salad had more dressing, just remember, your ancestors were out here eating chalk bread and rotten herring in a house full of fleas. Now that we've got a clear picture of what a typical meal looked like for your average medieval peasant, let's dig into something even more unsettling: how deeply food fraud ran in that world. Because it turns out that even when people finally managed to scrape together the bare minimum to survive, what they were eating wasn't always what they thought it was. Welcome to the world of adulterated food and drink. This wasn't just a matter of bad cooking, it was straight-up deception. And it could be dangerous. So let's rewind to the street-level scene of a medieval town. Imagine it's dawn. Fog rolls over the cobblestones. A baker named Alric unlocks the shutters of his small shop. He's tired. His flour supply is running low. The harvest was poor this year. Grain prices are sky high. And he's got mouths to feed his wife, 3 kids, and an aging mother. Desperate to stretch what little flour he has, Alrich reaches for a dusty sack of something else, ground acorns, and a handful of sawdust. It's not ideal. It's not even really food, but it's filler. And filler at this point is survival. This wasn't unusual. In fact, it was so common that laws were passed to try to stop it. In 13th century England, there was something called the Assize of Bread and Ale. It was basically an attempt at quality control before quality control was even a thing. Bakers had to follow strict rules about how much a loaf should weigh and what ingredients could go into it. If they cheated, they could be fined publicly, humiliated, or even chained in the town square with their fake bread tied around their neck like a badge of shame. And yet, they still did it, because the risk was worth it if it meant keeping the business and the family afloat. And it wasn't just the bakers. The brewing world was just as shady. Ale, as we talked about, was one of the few things safe to drink. But brewing was expensive. You needed barley yeast cleanish water and sometimes herbs for flavor. When profits dipped, brewers, especially the women known as alewives, started watering it down. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. Imagine going to your local tavern after a brutal day working in the fields, ready for a hearty pint, and getting something that tastes like barley-flavored pond water. Disappointing, sure, but more than that, it was dangerous. You were drinking it for safety and sustenance, and now it's neither. Let's zoom in on one of those alewives. Her name is Elizabeth. She's working in a cramped kitchen, sweating over a boiling cauldron. The fire is low because wood is expensive. Her children are hungry. She adds another bucket of water to the already thin ale. She knows it's not right. She remembers her grandmother's brew, rich, full-bodied, and nourishing. But that was a different time, a better harvest, a better economy. Now, survival trumps pride. This kind of corner-cutting, this desperation-driven fraud was woven into the very fabric of medieval life. The people making the food weren't evil. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were just stuck in a system that didn't give them many choices. They had bills to pay, families to feed, and lords to appease. And when the choice was between breaking a rule or going hungry, many chose to break the rule. But the people on the receiving end, your average villagers, were the real victims. They were already struggling, already malnourished. And now, the bread they relied on was filled with chalk. The ale was more water than brew, and the little indulgences they could afford were often not what they seemed. Let's talk a little more about those indulgences. Wine, for instance, was a status symbol. The good stuff was imported and expensive, definitely out of reach for commoners. But even the local wine could be a gamble. Some tavern owners mixed in herbs or other liquids to cover up spoilage. Others watered it down like ale. So instead of relaxing with a pleasant cup of wine, you might end up with a sour, vinegary mess that left you with a headache and maybe a bad stomach. What made things worse was the general distrust people had around food and drink. You couldn't be sure what was in it. You couldn't be sure who made it honestly. It wasn't uncommon for someone to get sick after a meal and blame not just bad ingredients, but curses or witchcraft. Alewives, especially, were often accused of supernatural wrongdoing. If her brew went bad, maybe she was a witch. Maybe she cursed it. Maybe someone cursed her. The line between bad brewing and black magic was thin, and a woman's livelihood could vanish overnight with the wrong accusation. And it's not like there were options. You couldn't just file a complaint with the medieval version of the FDA. You had to eat what you had. If the bread made your teeth hurt because of the sawdust, you ate it anyway. If the ale tasted like swamp water, you still drank it, because what else was there? Attempts to regulate this stuff did exist. There were public weigh-ins for bread. There were ale tasters appointed by the town council. There were punishments too, like public shaming being thrown in the stocks, or, in extreme cases, imprisonment. But enforcement was uneven, and a lot depended on who you knew. If a baker had friends in the right places, he might get away with it. If an alewife was well-liked, the community might look the other way. And if someone complained too loudly, well, they might find themselves cut off, or worse, accused of something themselves. All of this meant that for the average person, every meal was a gamble. It might fill your stomach, or it might give you stomach cramps. It might nourish you, or it might weaken you even more. In a world where food scarcity was already a fact of life, the added layer of deception and adulteration made survival even more complicated. So, next time you're sipping your favorite drink or biting into a warm piece of fresh, crusty bread, pause for a moment. Appreciate that it's not made of acorns or chalk. Appreciate that there are laws protecting what goes into it, and appreciate that we live in a time where food, while not always perfect, isn't usually a gamble between sustenance and sickness. And with that, let's move from the mystery of what's in the bread to something even harder to stomach the places where people ate it. Because as bad as the food might have been, the conditions in which it was stored, prepared, and eaten, that was a whole other nightmare. All right, so if you thought chalk-filled bread and watered-down ale were bad, buckle up, because we're about to step into the world of medieval hygiene, rather the total lack of it. This was a time when the concept of cleanliness as we know it didn't really exist. There were no disinfecting wipes, no food safety inspectors, and definitely no understanding of bacteria. People did the best they could, but they were fighting a battle they didn't even know they were in. Let's start with where food was prepared and eaten. Picture a peasant cottage. It's one room, maybe two if you're lucky. The floor is packed dirt, covered with old straw or rushes that get changed once in a while. In the corner, there's a smoky fire pit. Above it, a blackened iron pot hangs from a hook. That's your kitchen. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape, and most of it doesn't. Everything, and I mean everything, smells like soot. Now zoom out. Look to the edges of the room, and what do you see? Chickens. A pig rooting around. Maybe even a cow if the family's doing well. Yes, they kept animals indoors. Why? Because those animals were valuable. They gave milk, eggs, maybe meat eventually. And in winter, their body heat helped keep the place warm. But it also meant one very important thing: they pooped inside. Regularly. So you're eating your bowl of porridge next to a pig that's digging through the same floor rushes you sleep on. There's no sink, no running water, no soap, unless you made it yourself from leftover animal fat and ashes. And if you're thinking, well, surely they wash their hands before eating, the answer is probably not. They might rinse them in a bucket, maybe wipe them on a cloth, but that's about it. The result: contamination was absolutely everywhere. Food sat on the floor, dishes weren't scrubbed, they were rinsed at best if there was water to spare, and the water, often not clean. Wells could be contaminated, rivers were full of waste. In towns and cities, it was even worse. Streets were narrow, unpaved, and filled with garbage. Chamber pots were dumped right out the window. If you didn't shout, Gardes Low French for watch out for the water, before emptying one, you might be fined. Let's be real. This was a public health disaster waiting to happen. And it often did. One of the most notorious examples of the consequences of poor sanitation is the death of King John of England. In 1216, while traveling on a military campaign, he ate a meal that included peaches and cider, both rare treats at the time. But the fruit had probably gone bad. Whether it was the peaches themselves or the water used to wash them, something he consumed that day gave him a brutal case of dysentery. Within days, he was dead. And that's the king. The guy with the best access to food in the land. Now imagine what things were like for the common folk. In cities like London or Paris, the stench could be overwhelming. You had people, animals, refuse, and food all crammed into the same small space. Butchers slaughtered animals in open-air markets. Blood ran down the streets. Rats and flies were everywhere. Vermin spread disease from rotting meat to fresh produce without anyone realizing the danger. In fact, people believed disease came from bad smells, what they called miasmas. They weren't entirely wrong, but they were missing the crucial details. With no understanding of germs, folks didn't boil water to make it safe. They boiled it to make soup or ale. They didn't refrigerate meat. They covered it in salt or smoked it. And if that failed, they might still eat it. Sometimes they'd add strong spices or vinegar to mask the taste of spoilage. The flavor didn't matter as much as simply having anything to put in their stomachs. And it wasn't just dysentery. Typhoid, cholera, and parasites were everywhere. A cut of meat might carry tapeworms. Dirty hands could spread hepatitis. Bad water could lead to whole villages being wiped out by illness. And then, of course, there was the Black Death, the plague that decimated Europe in the 14th century didn't just show up out of nowhere. It thrived in the perfect storm of filth crowding and poor diet. The bacteria that caused the plague hitched a ride on fleas, which lived on rats, which lived in basically every medieval home and marketplace. Rats were attracted to food scraps, of which there were plenty, and fleas. They were happy to bite humans once their rodent host died. In cities, the death toll was horrifying. Whole neighborhoods were wiped out. Mass graves were dug. People believed the plague was a punishment from God, or blamed foreigners or Jews or witches. But at the heart of it all was a system that simply couldn't keep people safe. And yet somehow people survived. That's the part that always gets me. Despite the filth, the famine, the diseases, and the constant threat of poisoning from their own kitchens, medieval people adapted. They got creative with what they had. They used vinegar as a cleaner, burned herbs to purify the air, and relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. But they tried. In fact, some places made real efforts to clean up. Monasteries, for example, had surprisingly good hygiene practices for the time. Many had running water through aqueduct systems for bathing and stricter kitchen rules. They might not have known what bacteria were, but they had experience, and experience taught them that cleanliness to some degree kept people healthier. It's easy to look back and laugh at the medieval approach to hygiene. But here's the thing. We've only had modern sanitation for a very short time. Sewage systems, refrigeration, antibacterial soap. These are all recent luxuries. For the vast majority of human history, people lived as close to their animals as they did to their food. And they did it with no idea what invisible killers might be hiding in their bread, their water, or their fingers. So the next time you toss out that bruised apple or grumble about reheating leftovers, think of the peasant woman hunched over a smoky hearth trying to scrape the last bits of mold off a loaf of bread before feeding it to her children. Think of the baker who knew his dough was laced with sawdust, but didn't have the flour to do better. Think of the alewife trying to stretch a single sack of barley into enough drink to keep her tavern open for one more week. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just nourishment. It was a gamble, a risk, a daily test of ingenuity, endurance, and sheer luck. And yet, there was one powerful force that added even more pressure to this already precarious reality religion. In our next section, we're going to look at how the Catholic Church shaped medieval diets, imposed fasting, and complicated an already harsh existence with rules that could mean the difference between salvation or damnation. So far, we've been digging into what people ate, how they stored it, and why staying healthy while doing so was a daily battle. But if you were living in medieval Europe, there was another huge factor that shaped what ended up on your plate, and that was religion. Specifically, the Catholic Church. Because believe it or not, The church didn't just run the spiritual side of things, it basically ran the food system too. Let's talk about fasting. Today, when people fast, it's usually for health reasons or maybe as part of a personal, spiritual practice. But in the Middle Ages, it was mandatory, not suggested, not encouraged, required. The church calendar was filled with fasting days, anywhere from 135 to over 180 per year, depending on how strictly you followed the rules. That's nearly half the year. And these fasts weren't just about skipping a snack. They meant cutting out meat, dairy, eggs, and sometimes even animal fat, which, as we've already seen, were rare luxuries to begin with. So the days when a poor family might have had a bit of bacon or butter, gone. Replaced with fish or vegetables, assuming you could afford them. Let's say it's Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. It's cold. The fields are dead. The root cellar is nearly empty. You've already eaten the last of the pickled onions, and your bread is turning blue at the edges. But because it's Lent, you can't eat meat. No matter how hungry you are, no matter how much you might need the fat or the protein, if you break the rules and get caught, there could be consequences. Social consequences, spiritual consequences, eternal consequences. It sounds harsh, but to the people of the time, it was just life. They didn't question it because the church held incredible power, not just over food, but over birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. What you ate and when you ate it was part of your path to salvation. Obey the rules, and you'd earn points toward heaven. Break them, and, well, best not to think too hard about what came after that. This led to some weird loopholes. People being people, they found creative ways to bend the rules without technically breaking them. One famous example, beaver tails. Yup, beaver tails. See, the church declared that fish was okay to eat on fast days, but meat wasn't. And someone, probably a monk with a clever sense of logic, argued that since beavers lived in water and had scaly tails, their tails should count as fish. Believe it or not, the church agreed. So on fast days, you might see a wealthy monastery dining on roasted beaver tail while the peasants gnawed on dried turnips. It wasn't just beavers. Otters, puffins, and even barnacle geese made the list of sort of fish too. Barnacle geese were thought to be born from driftwood and barnacles not hatched from eggs, so they were considered ocean creatures, not birds. Totally fine for Lent. Makes sense, right? No. Well, medieval logic was its own kind of magic. For most people, though, these workarounds weren't even on the table. Fish was expensive if you didn't catch it yourself. And fasting just meant more porridge, more stale bread, more boiled cabbage. You might get lucky with some dried herring or smoked eel, but the average peasant wasn't eating seafood feasts. They were just going hungry. And it wasn't only about what you ate, it was how you thought about eating. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins. That meant eating too much, or eating with too much pleasure, was a spiritual problem. Food wasn't supposed to be fun. It was fuel for your soul. Eat modestly. Eat gratefully. Don't enjoy it too much. This mindset ran deep, especially in monastic communities. Monks followed strict diets, often eating just once or twice a day. Meat was banned, in many orders replaced with fish or eggs. Some monks fasted for days. Others gave up entire food groups permanently. The idea was that physical hunger brought you closer to God. It was a form of discipline, a way to purify the body and the spirit. But even within these rules, the wealthy still managed to live better. Nobles and bishops might fast from meat by eating elaborate fish pies, almond milk custards, or carefully prepared lentil stews. They had trained cooks who knew how to make fasting food taste like a celebration. Meanwhile, the poor had cabbage water and crusty barley bread. Same rules. Vastly different experience. There's another layer to all this feast days. If fasting was the spiritual low point of the calendar, feast days were the high. These were special days tied to saints' holy events or major celebrations, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and so on. On these days, the church actually encouraged people to celebrate with food, big meals, ale, meat if they had it. These were the rare moments when even a peasant might get a bit of fat in their diet. It was also one of the only times when communities came together around food. Think of it like the Super Bowl, but for salvation. The whole village might roast an ox or a pig. There'd be bread and ale and dancing and storytelling. People would dress up. Children would chase each other through the fields. It was a break from the hardship, a reminder of joy. But feast days had their own problems. For one, the food often ran out fast. The rich got the best cuts. The poor got scraps. And after the feast, it was back to fasting, back to rules, back to hunger. Still, these religious traditions gave structure to medieval life. They offered meaning to suffering, hope to hunger, and for many that was enough. What's interesting is how much control the church had over every part of this system. They didn't just say, "Don't eat meat." They owned the land where the cows grazed, the mills that ground the flour, and the markets where goods were sold. They collected tithes, basically a food tax from peasants. And they stored huge quantities of grain in monastic granaries while villages starved during a bad harvest. In theory, the church was a source of charity. In practice, it could be a source of inequality. So when we talk about food in the Middle Ages, we're not just talking about ingredients. We're talking about power. Power over bodies. Power over choices. Power over who gets to eat and who has to wait. And that power wasn't just political or economic. It was spiritual, eternal. The church didn't just control what went in your mouth. They believed they controlled what happened to your soul after you died. And maybe that's the part that's hardest to imagine from a modern perspective. Today, food is freedom. You can eat when you want, what you want, how you want. But in the Middle Ages, food was obedience. It was submission. It was proof of your faith or evidence of your sin. So, the next time you skip breakfast or go on a juice cleanse or decide to go vegan for a month, think of the medieval peasant forced to live on broth and barley because God and the church said so. But religion wasn't the only thing shaping medieval diets. There were also seasons, famines, droughts, and crop failures that could starve entire communities. In our next section, we'll explore what happened when nature turned against you and how fragile life really was when your next meal depended on the sky. We've seen how religion dictated when and what people ate in the Middle Ages. But what about the seasons? What about nature? Because even if you followed every rule from the church, even if you accepted hunger as part of spiritual life, you still had to answer to the weather. And in the medieval world, the weather didn't care about your prayers. Let's start with the basics: agriculture. The vast majority of medieval people were tied to the land. They were farmers, or more accurately, they were serfs, peasants who worked land owned by a lord in exchange for a tiny plot of their own and the right to survive. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons. Spring was planting. Summer was tending. Fall was harvest. Winter was survival. But all of that relied on the cooperation of one thing: the weather. And let me tell you, when the weather went bad in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Take the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It started with heavy rains in the spring of 1315. Not gentle April showers, We're talking weeks and weeks of relentless drenching downpours. Fields flooded, crops rotted, roads turned to mud, livestock couldn't graze, grain couldn't dry, and by the time the harvest season came around, there was almost nothing to gather. You might think, okay, one bad year. Surely they had stores or reserves. But here's the thing. They didn't. Most peasants lived harvest to harvest. A good year might let them store a bit of grain for winter, maybe enough to get through to spring. But two bad harvests in a row. That was a death sentence. And it didn't just stop at crops. With no grain, the price of bread soared. Poor families had to sell everything. Tools, livestock, even land, just to eat. Some turned to begging. Others in the most desperate corners of Europe turned to unthinkable things. There are historical reports, chilling, awful reports, of parents abandoning children, of grave robbing, of cannibalism. That's how bad it got. The famine didn't just kill through starvation. It opened the door for disease. A malnourished body is a weak one. With little food and even less clean water, illness spread like wildfire. Dysentery, typhoid, respiratory infections, diseases we barely think about today were deadly and constant companions during times of famine. And keep in mind, this wasn't some isolated village. The Great Famine affected much of Northern Europe. England, France, the Low Countries, parts of Germany, all suffered. It's estimated that somewhere between 10 to 15% of the population died. And this was a full generation before the Black Death came along and did even worse. Let's zoom in on what this looked like for an ordinary person. Imagine you're a young peasant named Elric. You live with your parents and two younger sisters on a small strip of land in northern England. It's spring. Your father comes in, soaked his face gray. He says the seeds have washed away. Again, the rye is ruined. There won't be a harvest. By midsummer, your stomach aches constantly. The bread your mother makes is stretched with beans and husks. It's hard, bitter, but it's all you have. You stop growing. Your bones feel too heavy. Your baby sister cries all night from hunger. One day, she just stops crying, and then she's gone. That's what famine meant. It wasn't just statistics. It was personal. It was trauma, baked into every generation that survived. And the cruel part, there was no backup plan, no government food banks, no international aid. The church might offer alms or soup, but it wasn't enough. Lords might lower rents or distribute grain, but that depended on how generous or selfish they were. Most people were left to fend for themselves, and when they couldn't, they died. But famine didn't always come from floods. Sometimes it was drought. If rains didn't come, the fields turned to dust. Wells dried up. Rivers shrank. Crops withered in the sun. It was a different flavor of disaster, but the result was the same hunger. And then there were the cold years. The so-called Little Ice Age began creeping in during the late Middle Ages. Winters got harsher. Growing seasons shortened. Snow arrived earlier and stayed longer. Entire regions that once supported crops became too cold to farm. Livestock froze. Food spoiled. It's hard to overstate how helpless medieval people were against these forces. They had no way to predict the weather beyond folk sayings and observation. No crop insurance. No artificial fertilizers to help push through a bad year. They worked the land, hoped for the best, and prayed it didn't all fall apart. This is where folklore and superstition came in. When the crops failed, people didn't blame carbon emissions or La Niña. They blamed sin, witches, curses, angry saints. Maybe someone had offended the local priest. Maybe someone made a deal with the devil. Maybe the miller's daughter was a little too strange, a little too quiet, and maybe she was the reason the wheat turned black. Desperation makes people cruel, and hunger makes them fearful. In famine years, witch trials often surged. Scapegoats were hunted down, mostly women, mostly older, widowed, or poor, people who couldn't defend themselves. It was easier to burn a witch than to accept that the sky just wasn't on your side. But famine didn't always come with disaster. Sometimes it came from policy. War could devastate a harvest. Soldiers marched through fields, trampling crops and slaughtering livestock. Raiding parties took grain as spoils. Villages were burned, food stores looted. Peasants fled or hid, leaving the land untended. And then there were taxes. Lords demanded their cut of the harvest, no matter how small. Even if you only pulled 2 sacks of barley from your patch of land, the taxman still came for his portion. And if you didn't pay, you could lose your land, or worse. It's no surprise that stories from this era are filled with food symbolism. The promise of a feast, the horror of an empty table. Bread wasn't just bread, it was life. It was grace. It was power. But even in the darkest times, people found ways to survive. They foraged, they preserved, they traded, they leaned on each other. A good year might follow a bad one. A neighbor might share a bit of butter or a handful of beans. A child might laugh in the middle of a starving village. Somehow, the human spirit pushed forward. So as we move into our next section, keep this in mind. Famine shaped more than just bodies, it shaped society. It forced innovation. It broke traditions. And in its wake, it often made room for something new. Which brings us to our next topic, how the rich and powerful ate during all this suffering. Because while peasants, starved lords and kings dined like gods, their food wasn't just nourishment, it was a performance. And what they ate said everything about who they were. So far, we've explored what peasants endured to simply stay alive. But what about the people at the top? The nobles, the clergy, the royals? What did they eat? While the rest of society scraped mold off barley bread or chewed dried roots during winter. Well, here's the short version. They ate like it was their divine right to be full, and in a way, they believed it was. Let's start with the basics. If you were a noble in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just food. It was power on a plate. Every meal was a chance to prove wealth status and control. So when a nobleman sat down to dine, he didn't just eat, he performed. Picture a great hall, stone walls hung with tapestries, torches flickering a long wooden table, stretching the length of the room. The Lord sits at the head. Below him, his family honored guests' knights, and maybe a visiting bishop or two. In the back, servants hustle in and out with steaming platters. Minstrels play soft music in the corner. Dogs mill about, hoping for scraps. The first course arrives. It's roasted swan, not chicken swan, decorated with feathers, gilded beak, and a sprig of rosemary. You don't eat it with your hands, you're given a knife and spoon, maybe even a personal towel to wipe your fingers. The meat is gamey, but tender. It's been marinated in spices from the East saffron cinnamon cloves. Each bite is a message I can afford flavor. Next up, a pie. But this isn't your average pie. It's a huge pastry filled with pigeon rabbit eggs, herbs, and fruit. And just for fun, maybe it's been baked with a surprise inside like live birds or frogs waiting to jump out when the crust is cut open. It's spectacle. It's theater. It's dinner. And the desserts. Oh, they were something else. Candied almonds, marzipan shaped like castles, sugared violets. And of course, wine, lots of wine. Not just to drink, but to cook with flavor sauces soak fruit. If you had money, you bathed in flavor. It's easy to look at these feasts and think, wow, must have been nice. But here's the twist, eating like a king had its own downsides. For one thing, most of the food was extremely heavy. Rich meats, buttery sauces, overly sweet desserts, all served in massive portions. There were no vegetables to balance things out, no fresh greens, unless it was a summer garden salad, and even then, that was peasant food. This kind of eating led to health issues, obesity, gout, tooth decay. Medieval doctors even wrote about diseases caused by too much indulgence. And there were rules, so many rules. Nobles were expected to follow strict etiquette at the table. You didn't just grab food, you waited to be served. You didn't reach across the table. You didn't eat too fast or make a mess. You had to carve meat gracefully. Offer portions to others before serving yourself. Wipe your hands constantly. Spit bones into a special dish, not on the floor like a peasant might. That's because noble meals weren't just about sustenance. They were about control, decorum, hierarchy. You could tell a person's rank by where they sat, what they were served, and how they ate it. Now, here's where it gets even more fascinating. Nobles didn't eat alone. Their meals were often public events. Feasts were used to show off, to display wealth, entertain allies, intimidate rivals, or celebrate events like weddings, coronations, or treaty signings. Let's say the local lord wants to impress a visiting noble from another region. He throws a feast. Over 100 people attend. The menu might include dozens of courses: boiled capon, venison stew, eel pie, stuffed quail, almond pudding. Exotic ingredients are brought in by cart and horse dates, ginger pomegranates. Spices that cost more than silver. And all of this is prepared by a full kitchen staff, head cook assistant, cooks, spit boys, scullions. Some large manors had hundreds of workers behind the scenes operating like a military kitchen. Every detail was scripted, every ingredient tracked. So where did they get all this food? Some came from the estate itself, livestock raised on noble lands, gardens tended by peasant laborers, fisheries, and hunting grounds reserved for the elite. The rest was imported, traded, or purchased at local markets. Nobles had the money and the power to access what others couldn't, and during times of famine, they still ate. Maybe not as extravagantly, but they were rarely hungry. It wasn't just about what they ate, it was about what they didn't eat. Peasants relied on barley. Nobles demanded wheat. Peasants boiled cabbage. Nobles roasted parsnips and butter and honey. Peasants drank ale. Nobles drank wine, even if it had to come all the way from Bordeaux or Burgundy. Every choice was a flex. And then there were the clergy. High-ranking church officials, bishops, abbots, cardinals, often lived like nobles. They had their own estates, their own cooks, their own feasts. Ironically, the same church that told peasants to fast was often gorging itself behind monastery walls. Monks might not eat meat directly, but they found ways around it, like those fish beaver tails, or meat cooked into pies, so it looked less sinful. But this lifestyle wasn't just about indulgence. It was symbolic. Nobles saw their ability to feast as a sign of divine favor. If you were rich enough to eat like this, it meant God had blessed you. It meant you were chosen. Your wealth, your land, your servants, all part of the natural order. That's what they believed. And the food they ate wasn't just cooked, it was documented. Medieval cookbooks began to appear among the wealthy. The Form of Cury, written by the master cooks of King Richard II, was one of the earliest. These books didn't just list recipes, they listed rituals. How to prepare swan with orange sauce. How to boil lamprey in wine. how to layer a three-tiered meat pie with game birds inside. So while the poor were boiling cabbage and stretching barley with beans, the rich were commissioning menus that required teams of cooks and pages of instructions. But here's the wild part: sometimes nobles pretended to eat like peasants for fun. There are records of royal feasts where nobles, dressed as shepherds, sat on straw and ate humble-looking meals. Of course, the meals were made by gourmet chefs, and the humble dishes were still packed with rare spices. But it was all theater, a game of slumming it that made them feel closer to their subjects without any of the suffering. It was a sharp contrast. One world of hunger, the other of excess. But both were part of the same society, locked in a system where food defined everything. In the next section, we'll explore one of the most dangerous aspects of medieval dining poison. Because when you're living in a world where food is power, that power can be weaponized. And sometimes the banquet table wasn't a place to celebrate, it was a battlefield. Now that we've explored both ends of the medieval food chain, from starving peasants to feasting lords, it's time to talk about something even darker. Because in a world where food meant survival and status, it also meant danger. Welcome to the silent killer of the medieval dining table poison. Let's get one thing straight: this wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was real. People were genuinely afraid of being poisoned, and with good reason. The upper classes, especially royalty and nobility, lived in a constant state of paranoia about what might be hidden in their next meal. After all, food wasn't just a private affair. It was public, it was political, and it was the easiest way to get close to someone powerful, especially if you wanted them dead. Imagine a royal banquet in a crowded hall. Music's playing, silver goblets gleam, trays of golden roasted birds and steaming pastries are paraded down the table. And at the center, a king sits, smiling and sipping from a goblet of wine. He raises a fork to his mouth, but then pauses. Because for every monarch in Europe, that moment came with a very real fear. What if this bite is the last thing I ever eat? To guard against this, kings and nobles developed entire systems of food security. First up, tasters. These were trusted servants or officials who ate a sample of every dish before it was served to their master. The idea was simple: if the food was poisoned, the taster would die first. Grim job, right? But it was considered an honor, and in some courts, it was even a requirement of high rank. Then there were elaborate rituals. Meals were prepared in locked kitchens, ingredients were inspected. Cooks were vetted, sometimes even watched over by guards. Dishes were sealed and signed with wax. Some nobles ate only food cooked by their personal chef, even when traveling. Others brought their own ingredients, utensils, or even water to avoid risk. And just in case, there were countermeasures. Antidotes, charms, amulets. People carried bezoars, strange-looking stones from animal intestines believed to detect poison. Some wore rings filled with crushed herbs. Others drank wine from goblets made of unicorn horn, which were actually narwhal tusks believed to neutralize toxins. Let's talk about one famous case: King John of Bohemia. In 1346, he reportedly fell sick after a meal and believed he'd been poisoned. He survived, but many others didn't. Pope Clement II died suddenly in 1047, possibly poisoned. King Edward II, rumors swirled for years. Even within the Vatican, cardinals accused each other of poisoning during papal elections. Trust no one. And it wasn't just the elite. In monasteries where power rivaled that of kings, abbots, and bishops were sometimes targeted with poisoned wine or meat. Rival factions within the church saw food as a tool, not just for celebration, but for silencing. Of course not. Every death was a murder. Food safety was abysmal, and natural food poisoning was everywhere. spoiled meat, moldy grain, contaminated water. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grew on rye, caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. It's even been blamed for outbreaks of mass hysteria and witch trials. But when someone high profile died unexpectedly, the first question wasn't, did he eat bad fish? It was, who poisoned him? That fear bled into the literature of the time. In medieval tales, poison was a common plot device. Lovers tricked with tainted potions. Enemies brought down at banquets. Even in Shakespeare, centuries later, you see it everywhere. Hamlet's father poisoned in his ear, Claudius trying to poison Hamlet's wine. That paranoia had roots deep in the Middle Ages. But poisoning wasn't just for killing, it was for manipulation. Let's say you're a minor noble with a rival family trying to steal your land. You can't go to war, it's too expensive. You can't go to court, it's corrupt. But you can invite the rival lord to a feast, offer him wine, and maybe slip in a powder you bought from a shady apothecary. Not enough to kill him, just enough to make him sick. While he's bedridden, you move on his property. Or get him to sign something he shouldn't. It wasn't just violence, it was strategy. And where did people even get poison? Medieval apothecaries were part pharmacist, part witch doctor. They sold everything from herbal remedies to deadly tinctures. Hemlock, belladonna, mandrake, even arsenic. Some were disguised as medicine. Others were clearly labeled if you were rich enough to afford the risk. Some poisons were common knowledge. Everyone knew that certain mushrooms were deadly. That spoiled fish could kill. That bitter almonds contained something dangerous. The problem was, you couldn't always tell. Some poisons had no smell, no taste. And by the time symptoms appeared, headache, vomiting, fever, it was often too late. This uncertainty added a whole new layer to eating. Every bite, every sip was a test of trust. Who made the food? Who served it? Who stood to gain? If you never woke up, it wasn't just about the person cooking. It was about everyone who touched the meal. The servant who chopped the onions, the stable boy who fetched the herbs, the kitchen maid who set the tray, the cupbearer, the dishwasher, the messenger who delivered the honey. All were potential threats. That's why some nobles created secret dining rooms. Meals were brought in through complicated systems of hallways and hatches. Some kings, like Louis XIV of France, a bit later in history, had food tested 3 times before it even reached his plate. And even then, he barely touched it. All of this fear bled into hospitality customs. When you visited someone powerful, it was expected that the host would take the first bite to prove the food was safe. Refusing to do so, that was a red flag, a declaration of hostility. Eating together wasn't just social, it was political theater. A peace treaty sealed with roasted duck and a shared goblet. But despite all the caution, poison still worked. Quiet, elegant, no blade, no blood, just a headache, a slow fever, a whispered rumor, and then silence. And it didn't stop in the Middle Ages. This legacy of poison as power lived on in royal courts for centuries. But it was in the medieval period that it took hold of the imagination and the dinner table. So, the next time you sit down to eat and reach for your wine glass, take a moment. Remember that not too long ago, that sip might have been your last. But let's shift gears. Because while the rich feared poison and the poor feared hunger, both groups shared one important thing: cooking itself. And in our next section, we're going into the heart of the medieval kitchen. The tools, the techniques, the fire, the knives, the bubbling pots of broth and stew. It was hot, it was loud, and it was where the magic or the disaster happened. If the medieval feast was a grand performance, then the kitchen was the stage crew, sweating, shouting always on the edge of chaos. Behind every platter of gilded roast swan or bowl of watery pottage was an army of hands, feet, firewood, and blades. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, hot, smoky, loud, and absolutely essential. Let's start with the layout. A typical peasant kitchen wasn't really a kitchen at all. It was just a corner of a single-room home, maybe separated by a curtain or low wall. The hearth, an open fire pit, was the heart of it all. No chimney, just smoke rising through a hole in the roof or leaking through the walls. It filled the room, coated every surface in soot, and got in your eyes, your throat, your clothes. There were no stovetops, no ovens, unless you lived in a village with a communal bakehouse. Instead, peasants cooked over fire using iron pots, cauldrons, or pans suspended from hooks or laid on coals. You had to control the temperature with instinct. No dials, just logs and ash, and the experience passed down from your grandmother's cracked hands. Water. You fetched it from a stream, a well, or a rain barrel. Salt, precious. You used it sparingly. Knives were tools, not cutlery, mostly dull, passed down, hand-forged. And forget forks. Those wouldn't become common in Europe until centuries later. Most people used a spoon, a knife, and their fingers. The kitchen floor was packed dirt. Sometimes straw was spread down to soak up spills. It smelled like smoke, onions, and sweat. Chickens wandered underfoot. Dogs begged for scraps. Children hovered near the fire for warmth, risking burns for a few moments of comfort. Now shift scenes. You're not in a peasant's hovel anymore. You're in the kitchen of a manor or a castle. This is a whole different beast. The kitchen is still smoky, but its enormous stone walls, iron racks, wooden beams blackened with grease. Fires blaze in multiple hearths. Rotating spits roast entire boars or deer turned by hand or by dog-powered treadmills, yes, actual dogs running on wheels to spin meat. There are rooms within. Rooms, a bakery for bread, a scullery for washing dishes, a pantry for storing dry goods, and a larder for meats. Everything has its place, and every servant has a task. There's the head cook, who answers to the steward or directly to the lord. He's the boss. Then there are the undercooks, the turnbroaches, the guys who turn the spits, the scullions, the lowest rung doing all the dirty work, and the butlers who handle beverages and sometimes spices. Noise echoes off the stone. Knives chop, pans clatter, meat sizzles. Instructions are shouted, fires are stoked, flour dust clouds the air. It's like a medieval version of a modern restaurant kitchen, except with more danger, more animals, and a much higher chance of setting your robe on fire. And speaking of danger, everything in a medieval kitchen could kill you. Fires weren't contained. Burns were common. Knives were crude and heavy. Accidents happened. And if someone cut themselves, it could mean infection. No antibiotics, no band-aids, just a poultice and a prayer. But for all its hazards, the medieval kitchen was a place of immense creativity. Let's talk about some of the techniques cooks used. Roasting was a big deal, especially for the rich. Whole animals, spit roasted over open flames, basted with herbs, wine, or honey. Baking happened in ovens, either communal village ovens or private ones in big estates. Bread was the main focus, but you'd also get pies, both savory and sweet pastries and tarts. Boiling and stewing were the most common methods for the poor. Toss everything. Bones, vegetables, grains into a single pot and let it simmer all day. It fed more people and used fewer ingredients. Frying was rare mostly because oil was expensive. But when available, fritters, fish, or meat would be shallow fried in pans over coals. Grilling was more of a field thing, soldiers or travelers cooking meat quickly over coals or fire. And then there were preservation techniques: salting, smoking, pickling, drying. People didn't just cook for today, they had to prepare for winter. Every bit of fat, every piece of fruit had to be preserved somehow. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. Now let's talk about flavor. We often imagine medieval food as bland, but that's a myth. If you had access to spices, you used them liberally. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, saffron, ginger. These weren't just for taste, they were status symbols. Putting spices in your food was like wearing jewelry on your plate. Even in peasant kitchens, people flavored what they could. Leeks, garlic, onions, mustard seeds. Wild herbs gathered from the woods. Vinegar added tang. Honey added sweetness. If your barley soup was dull, you added herbs. If your meat was turning, you masked it with onions. Recipes weren't written the way they are today. A medieval recipe might say, take a capon and boil it with good spices and almond milk. That's it. No amounts, no times. You had to know what good spices meant. You had to feel your way through it. Cooking wasn't science, it was intuition. And because nothing was standardized, every region had its own variations. A pie in London was different from a pie in Toulouse. Even ale tasted different from town to town based on the water, the grain, the method. Food was local, personal, alive. And despite everything, despite the hunger, the fire, the danger, there was beauty in the way people fed each other. A mother stirring porridge with her baby strapped to her back. A monk carefully folding dough before sunrise. A scullion singing softly as he scrubbed pots with sand and cold water. These kitchens, rough as they were, held warmth, nourishment, and in a way hope, because when the harvest failed, when the taxes rose, when sickness spread, and saints fell silent, it was still the kitchen that kept people going. But all of this, the labor, the fire, the flavor, it was always threatened by one last force: war. In our next section, we'll look at how conflict ravaged food supplies, destroyed farmland, and changed forever what people ate and how they survived. Because in the Middle Ages, war wasn't just fought with swords, it was fought over bread. We've wandered through smoky kitchens, crowded feast halls, and hungry peasant cottages. But now, it's time to talk about something that could turn all of that to ash overnight. Something that destroyed grain stores, emptied pantries, and salted fields. War. In the Middle Ages, war wasn't an event, it was a condition. If you lived between the 5th and 15th centuries, chances were high that you'd experience conflict at some point in your life. Maybe it was a local feud between barons. Maybe it was a crusade, a rebellion, a civil war, or an invasion. Whatever it was, war didn't just affect soldiers. It devoured civilian life, and food was often the first casualty. Let's start with the basics: armies moved on their stomachs. That's not a metaphor. If a medieval army didn't have food, it didn't function. Soldiers needed calories, lots of them. So, when an army rolled into town, they didn't bring giant food trucks or neatly packed supply crates. They took what they needed from you. If you were a peasant and soldiers came through your village, they'd take your chickens, your goats, your grain, your beer. If you had a pig, they'd slaughter it. If you had bread, they'd eat it. If you had nothing, they might burn your home just for the trouble. And if the army was foreign or from a rival lord, forget it. They'd treat your land like enemy territory, even if you had no idea why the war had started in the first place. And it wasn't just one side doing this. Both armies raided the same villages. One day French troops, next day English, or Saxons, or Normans, or mercenaries who didn't care what banner flew overhead. Farms were destroyed, fields trampled, wells poisoned, orchards cut down, food stores looted. What wasn't stolen was burned. And it wasn't always a mistake, it was a tactic. Scorched earth. If you couldn't hold the land, deny it to your enemies. That meant starving entire regions just to delay an army's march. Take the 100 Years' War between England and France. It wasn't 100 years of straight fighting, but it dragged on so long, 1337 to 1453, that multiple generations were born, lived and died under the shadow of conflict. Villages were wiped out, rebuilt, and destroyed again. Grain prices soared, famine followed. The war didn't just kill with swords, it killed with empty bellies. And then there were sieges. These were the slow killers of medieval warfare. Imagine your city, surrounded. No one goes in, no one comes out. The fields are beyond the walls, and the harvest is trapped outside. What food you had inside dwindles fast. At first you ration. Then you start eating the dried stuff. Then the moldy stuff. Then you boil leather. You chew bark. You eat rats, cats, dogs. You hide your last biscuit under your mattress, hoping no one finds it. And then, when the enemy finally breaches the gates, if you're still alive, you're too weak to fight. One of the most famous examples, the Siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099. Crusaders starving outside. Defenders starving inside. When the walls finally fell, what followed was not just a battle, it was a massacre. Hunger had broken everyone, and the horrors didn't stop there. After the soldiers were fed, they still had to feed their horses. Cavalry needed fodder, grain, hay, and guess where that came from? Yep, your fields. Even if you'd somehow hidden your crops from the men, the horses sniffed them out. But here's a strange twist. War also created food innovation. When preservation became a matter of survival, people got creative. Drying beef, smoking fish, salting pork so heavily it could survive for months. Hardtack rock-like biscuits that could last years became a soldier's staple. Boiled down broths turned into jelly-like pastes, a medieval version of stock cubes. And siege cooks got inventive too. In starving cities, bakers mixed sawdust with flour. Soup was made from boiled bones with barely any meat. Anything that had calories was fair game. It was disgusting. It was desperate. But it worked. Sometimes. On rare occasions, war even shifted diets permanently. Take the Crusades. When Europeans returned from the Holy Land, they brought back more than wounds, they brought back food. Spices, rice, lemons, pomegranates, sugar, new cooking methods. War had ripped them from their homes, but it had also connected them to different cuisines. The world opened just a little. Of course, most people didn't benefit from that. The average peasant didn't come back from the Crusades with a recipe for saffron chicken. They came back with trauma. If they came back at all, women, children, and the elderly suffered most during wartime food shortages. Men were conscripted. Fields went untended. Grain couldn't be harvested. Even in peaceful years, villages might spend seasons recovering from the last raid. And remember the church. It didn't stop collecting tithes just because your crops had been torched. You still owed your portion. If you couldn't pay in grain, you'd pay in labor, or livestock, or lose your land entirely. What's more, war disrupted trade routes. Cities that relied on imported salt oil or wine found themselves cut off. Inns and taverns lost access to ale shipments. Fishmongers couldn't get barrels of herring from the coast. Bakers had to switch flours. Brewers watered down their ale. People adapted or starved. This constant instability meant that every bite of food in the Middle Ages carried a weight, not just of hunger, but of memory. You remembered the bread you lost, the stew you had during the siege, the smoked ham that kept your family alive for another week. So while war was fought with swords and shields, it was survived with spoons and scraps. And still, people endured. Villagers replanted. Women rebuilt ovens. Children carried water to new fields. Even when everything had burned, the first thing they tried to recover wasn't a castle or a church. It was the kitchen. Because until you had food, you didn't have a future. In our final section, we'll step back and look at the big picture, how all of this from hunger to feasts, fasting to poison made food more than just survival in the Middle Ages. It was identity. It was power. It was life and death every single day. So here we are. After walking through famine and feast poverty and plenty kitchens and battlefields, one thing becomes clear. Food in the Middle Ages was never just food. It was survival, yes, but it was also culture. It was status. It was religion, medicine, politics, and identity served one wooden bowl or silver platter at a time. For peasants, food was often simple and repetitive, but not without care. Barley bread, cabbage, stew, cheese, if you were lucky, ale when the harvest was kind. It was humble, but it was the heart of daily life. Every family had their own rhythms, who stirred the pot, who kneaded the dough, who gathered the herbs. Food was shared, not hoarded, and when it was scarce, you learned to make something out of nothing. You stretched what little you had. You traded, you scraped, you gave your children your portion when it came to that. And still, people took pride in it. A mother could still make a soup that comforted. A farmer could still grow beans that filled stomachs through winter. There was quiet strength in that kind of cooking. It was survival and love wrapped in the same crust of bread. But for the rich, food was theater. It was a stage for wealth, power, and extravagance. Meals were curated to dazzle. The bigger the feast, the higher the status. Courses upon courses. Meats sculpted into birds with wings reattached. Wines aged in cellars. Dishes described in Latin. It was all designed to say, I am above you. My hunger matters more than yours. And yet that same food was a source of anxiety. For nobles and kings, every bite could be their last. Poison haunted their cups. Enemies sent messages with meat. Trust was a luxury just like saffron or cloves. So they created rituals to protect themselves. Tasters, servants, locks, symbols carved into bread to ward off evil. Meals became fortresses. Then came the church, the spiritual dietitians of the age. They told people when to fast, what to eat, what to avoid. Gluttony was sin, so was waste, but moderation. That was virtue, at least on paper. In reality, even monasteries held secrets behind their kitchens. Fish that wasn't fish. Loopholes that allowed feasts on fasting days. The sacred calendar carved out a strange relationship with food, one that mixed guilt and indulgence in equal measure. Meanwhile, the seasons didn't care about status or salvation. When the rains came too soon or didn't come at all, everyone suffered. Famine wasn't spiritual, it was brutal. Fields drowned, livestock died, people turned on each other. Bones showed through skin. The dinner table vanished altogether, and in war food was both weapon and casualty. Armies burned what they couldn't eat. Sieges starved cities into submission. Villagers fed troops or fled from them. Food became the line between those who could go on and those who couldn't. But through it all, something remarkable happened. People adapted. They didn't give up. They found ways to feed each other, to cook without spices, to plant in frozen ground, to invent new dishes out of desperation. That's what makes medieval food so fascinating. It wasn't just about what was cooked, it was about the will to cook at all. Even the cookbooks of the time, rare and elite as they were told a story. They didn't just list meals, they told us how people thought about food, how they used it to impress, to heal, to praise, to punish. Recipes were spells, prayers, and blueprints all in one. Think about that next time you eat a slice of bread. That loaf carries the legacy of millennia of trial, toil, and transformation. Barley and wheat, fire and stone, hunger and hope, because food in the Middle Ages wasn't frozen in time. It evolved, it traveled, it mingled, it told stories, it crossed borders long before passports. The vinegar in a stew might have started in the Middle East. The salt on a fish might have come from the North Sea. The technique for roasting might have passed from Roman soldiers to Saxon farmers to Norman knights. And today, so much of what we eat still bears the imprint of that era. Pies, ale, cheese, stews, spices, even the concept of a kitchen with tools and roles and rituals, it all started somewhere. And a lot of it started here in the smoke and chaos of medieval life. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: when you have nothing, food is everything. And when you have everything, food can still betray you. So, whether you're imagining a peasant warming porridge over a low fire or a king poking suspiciously at a jeweled pastry, remember this? In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just a backdrop to life. It was life. Every bite had meaning. Every meal told a story. And that's a story still unfolding today on every plate, in every kitchen, every time we gather at a table. We're Count 106. 300-word summary. Food in the Middle Ages was far more than mere sustenance. For the poor, it was the daily battle for survival. Barley bread, cabbage stews, scraps of cheese. For the wealthy, it was a display of power, spiced meats, elaborate pastries, banquets served with pomp and fear of poison. Kitchens ranged from smoky corners in peasant homes to sprawling castle complexes staffed with dozens of workers. Religion dictated what people could eat, and when layering fasting and feast days with spiritual meaning, while nature's unpredictability turned every harvest into a gamble. Famine was common. From floods to droughts, to the brutal winters of the Little Ice Age, food scarcity haunted the peasantry. Disease followed hunger. Death was familiar. Yet even in famine, people found ways to adapt by preserving, stretching, or foraging what little they had. War added a cruel layer. Armies pillaged fields, scorched earth, and starved cities through siege. Food became both a casualty and a weapon. Yet even in the ashes of war, communities rebuilt, planting again, cooking again. Throughout it all, food united people. Around hearths and feasts, in sickness and celebration, it remained the center of life. It was both comfort and danger, necessity and luxury, symbol and substance. This is the story of medieval food, not just what people ate, but how they lived through it.